The house had learned to be quiet long before the knock arrived. Silence had become a practiced discipline rather than an absence of sound, shaped by weeks of listening for what could not be seen. Curtains were drawn not for darkness but for survival, furniture positioned less for comfort than for habit, pathways through rooms memorized so that movement could happen without light. The air itself felt trained, held in place by caution. Every object seemed aware of the war, as if walls and floors understood that to exist was already to risk discovery. In such a place, time did not move forward so much as it accumulated, layering tension upon memory until the present felt permanently weighted. The woman sat with her body angled toward the door, not because she expected escape, but because experience had taught her that whatever came would come from there. Her posture was not rigid with fear but prepared with resignation, the kind that forms after terror has been repeated enough times to become predictable. She had learned not to pace, not to rehearse outcomes, not to pray aloud. Instead, she focused on small, controllable things: the texture of the chair beneath her, the faint draft along the floor, the rhythm of her own breathing slowed deliberately so it would not betray her presence. Fear no longer announced itself dramatically, it arrived quietly, folded into routine. Occupation had rewritten the meaning of domestic space. The house was no longer a refuge but a holding pattern, a temporary allowance granted by forces outside its walls. Doors, once symbols of privacy, had become points of vulnerability. Each knock in the past had arrived with authority already decided, carrying orders that could not be negotiated. Men had entered without invitation, voices sharp with certainty, hands quick to search and seize. The house remembered those moments even if it showed no physical damage. Memory lived in the grain of the wood, in the way the woman avoided standing directly in the doorway, in how she positioned herself so she would not have to turn her back. She did not know exactly when the expectation of cruelty had settled into her bones, only that it had become reliable. At first, there had been shock, then disbelief, then anger. Those phases had passed. What remained was a form of endurance stripped of illusion. Stories circulated constantly, neighbors taken for questioning and not returned, families displaced overnight, kindness punished as collaboration. Rumor filled the gaps where information should have been, and rumor always leaned toward the worst. To survive meant assuming that the worst was not just possible but likely. Outside, the war asserted itself in fragments rather than spectacle. There were no battles here, no columns of tanks rolling past the window. Instead, there were boots on stone, the distant hum of vehicles, the occasional shouted command echoing briefly before being swallowed by streets that pretended normality. The violence of occupation was administrative, methodical, enforced through presence rather than constant action. That presence pressed inward, shrinking lives without needing to touch them. It taught people to self-regulate, to anticipate punishment before it arrived. The woman's thoughts did not race, they narrowed. She reviewed nothing because there was nothing left to review. There were no documents to hide, no plans to revise. What she had was what she had, and it was already known that discovery did not require guilt. Innocence offered no protection in a system that valued control over truth. She understood this not as ideology but as pattern. The pattern said that authority arrived with contempt, that fear was intentional, that suffering served a purpose beyond the individual. When the sound finally came, it did not startle her. The knock was firm, unhurried, the kind that carried confidence rather than urgency. It confirmed what she had already sensed in the air, a subtle shift that precedes intrusion. Her body responded automatically, shoulders settling, jaw tightening, breath paused at the top of her chest. This was not panic but readiness, the final alignment before submission. She did not stand immediately. There was no advantage in haste. Delay sometimes bought clarity, sometimes nothing at all. In that suspended interval, the past crowded close. She remembered other doors, other voices, other outcomes. She remembered how humiliation could arrive disguised as procedure, how cruelty often wore the mask of order. She remembered the way men avoided eye contact when carrying out instructions, as if distance could absolve them. These memories did not feel distant or separate. They were active, informing her expectations with ruthless efficiency. The knock was not a question. It was a statement that whatever remained private was about to be tested. The house seemed to hold its breath with her. No one else moved. If there were others inside, they understood the ritual as well as she did. There would be no whispering, no scrambling, no last-minute decisions. Everything that could be hidden had already been hidden, and everything that could not was already exposed. The danger now was not discovery but reaction, saying the wrong thing, moving too quickly, appearing defiant or weak. Survival depended on presenting oneself as manageable. She stood slowly, aware of how sound carried in enclosed spaces. Each step toward the door felt deliberate, measured, as though she were walking toward a known injury. Her hand hovered briefly before touching the handle, not from hesitation but from acknowledgement. This moment mattered, not because it could be changed, but because it would be remembered. War reduced lives to such moments, compressing meaning into seconds that stretched far beyond their duration. She braced not for pain exactly, but for erasure, the sense of being reduced to a function within someone else's authority. Cruelty did not always involve violence. Sometimes it arrived as indifference, as the refusal to recognize individuality. That, she had learned, was often worse. It left no marks but hollowed something essential. She prepared herself to become small, to offer as little resistance as possible, to endure whatever tone would be used to remind her that she did not belong to herself. Her expectations were so complete that they left no room for alternatives. She did not imagine mercy because imagining it had once been dangerous. Hope, when disproven, hurt more than fear ever had. Fear at least could be managed. It could be anticipated, shaped, absorbed into routine. Hope made demands. It asked for trust, and trust had become a liability. So she stood at the door armored in certainty, convinced that what waited on the other side would confirm everything the war had taught her. In that instant before opening the door, the world felt fixed, governed by rules that no longer surprised her. Power would assert itself. She would comply. The house would remain standing, altered only by the memory of another encounter. This was how days continued, not through progress, but through repetition. The knock was simply the next iteration, and she met it with the only preparation left to her, the quiet resolve to endure whatever cruelty was about to enter. The sound that followed the knock did not arrive all at once. It emerged carefully, as if testing the space it was about to enter. The woman had already arranged herself internally for a raised voice, for clipped syllables sharpened by authority, for a tone that carried impatience or contempt. She expected language to be used as a weapon, words delivered not to communicate but to dominate. That expectation was so complete that when the first syllable reached her ears, it took a moment for her mind to register that something was wrong with the pattern. The voice was calm. Not artificially softened, not exaggerated in politeness, but steady, controlled, almost restrained. It did not rush. It did not bark an order or demand immediate compliance. It carried confidence without hostility, authority without theatrical force. The accent, unmistakably British, placed it outside the framework her fear had constructed. It did not belong to the occupiers whose language had become synonymous with threat. The familiarity of danger was suddenly absent, and that absence was deeply unsettling. For a brief moment, her body failed to respond. She had prepared herself for fear, but not for confusion. Muscles that had learned to tighten on command hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without the usual stimulus. Her breath caught not from terror, but from the effort of recalibration. This was not how these encounters began. Something essential was missing, and without it, the ritual she relied upon to survive felt incomplete. The voice spoke again, still measured, still calm. There was no visible urgency behind it, no sense of escalation. It did not push itself into the space but waited, allowing silence to exist without filling it. That pause carried its own weight. Silence under occupation was rarely neutral. It usually preceded punishment. Yet this silence felt different. It did not threaten. It observed. Inside the house, time seemed to stretch unevenly. Seconds elongated, while thoughts arrived in fragments. She searched her memory for similar moments, for any precedent that could explain this deviation. There were none. All previous encounters had followed the same trajectory: knock, command, intrusion. This pause, this calm voice lingering outside the door, existed outside her experience. Without a script to follow, her sense of control weakened rather than strengthened. She became acutely aware of the small details she had ignored moments before. The grain of the door beneath her fingertips. The slight echo of the voice against the narrow corridor. The way her heartbeat no longer matched the rhythm she had trained it to adopt in moments of danger. Her body wanted to respond, to act, but her mind hesitated, unsure what response was safest when the threat did not present itself clearly. The accent itself carried implications she struggled to process. British. Liberator, according to whispered rumors and distant broadcasts. Yet the war had taught her that labels meant little at the level of the door. Soldiers were still soldiers. Uniforms still carried power. Hope built on nationality alone felt dangerously naive. And yet, the voice did not align with her stored images of military authority. It lacked the sharp edges she had learned to fear. This dissonance created a new kind of vulnerability. When brutality was expected, endurance became possible. One could brace, endure, survive. But when calm appeared instead, it demanded interpretation. It forced her to engage rather than withdraw. It asked her to listen, truly listen, and listening carried risk. Words could mislead as easily as weapons could harm. She realized then how much of her survival depended on predictability. The occupier's cruelty, however horrific, had followed patterns. There were rules, even if they were unjust. Calm shattered those rules. It introduced uncertainty where certainty had been her shield. She could not decide whether this voice signaled safety or simply a different form of control. Her hand remained on the door, unmoving. She was aware that delay itself could be interpreted as resistance, yet the voice outside had not framed the moment as a test. There was no warning, no countdown. That absence of pressure felt intentional, and its intentionality was unnerving. Power that did not rush suggested confidence of a different kind, one that did not need to assert itself loudly to be effective. Inside her mind, fear and curiosity collided. Fear warned her that any deviation from expectation could be dangerous. Curiosity whispered that something rare was unfolding, something she might never encounter again. The war had stripped life of nuance, reducing interactions to binaries: safe or dangerous, friend or enemy. This moment refused to fit into those categories, and that refusal demanded attention. The voice spoke once more, still calm, still controlled. It did not grow impatient. It did not change tone to force compliance. The restraint was unmistakable. It communicated not weakness, but choice. Whoever stood on the other side of the door was choosing how to wield authority, and that choice did not involve fear as its primary instrument. She felt the effect of that choice ripple through her. Her shoulders, tense moments earlier, lowered almost imperceptibly. Her breath, shallow and controlled, deepened without her permission. These changes alarmed her. Relaxation in wartime was dangerous. Lowering one's guard invited harm. Yet her body responded before her mind could intervene, reacting to calm as if it were safety. This realization unsettled her more than the knock itself had. It exposed how deeply violence had conditioned her, how thoroughly fear had been trained into reflex. The calm voice did not erase that conditioning, but it challenged it, creating a crack in the armor she had built. Through that crack came not relief, but a fragile, unwanted sense of possibility. She wondered briefly about the person behind the voice. Not as an individual with a life or past, but as an agent of a system that operated differently from the one she knew. What kind of training produced such restraint? What purpose did it serve? Was it tactical, designed to disarm through reassurance rather than intimidation? Or was it genuine, an expression of a different moral framework operating within the same brutal war? These questions had no immediate answers, and the lack of answers made the moment heavier rather than lighter. The war had taught her to distrust appearances. Calm could be deceptive. Politeness could precede betrayal. Yet the longer the voice remained steady, the harder it became to dismiss it as a trick. Deception usually hurried. It relied on speed, surprise, confusion. This calm lingered, patient and unforced. Around her, the house remained still. No one else intervened. No external sound intruded. The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and the door, to the thin barrier separating expectation from experience. She became aware that whatever happened next would alter something fundamental, not because of its outcome, but because of its tone. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to moral disorientation. The war had simplified morality through brutality, making cruelty an expected function of power. This voice suggested another possibility, that authority could exist without humiliation, that control could be exercised without stripping dignity. The idea felt dangerous not because it was cruel, but because it was hopeful. She did not want hope. Hope demanded engagement. It demanded belief. And belief, once broken, left scars deeper than fear ever had. She tried to retreat internally, to reassert the mental distance she relied upon, but the calm voice made that retreat difficult. It did not allow her to disappear into expectation. It held her in the present moment, asking her, without words, to acknowledge it as it was rather than as she feared it would be. Her stillness took on a different quality. It was no longer the stillness of submission, but of suspension. She was frozen not by terror, but by the need to decide how to interpret what she was hearing. In that frozen state, the war briefly lost its grip on inevitability. Outcomes no longer felt predetermined. The future, usually a narrow corridor of dread, widened just enough to reveal alternatives. That widening terrified her. It exposed how much she had relied on certainty, even when that certainty was cruel. The calm British voice did not promise safety, but it undermined despair's monopoly on expectation. And in doing so, it introduced a new risk. The risk of believing that this encounter might not follow the rules that had governed all the others. She remained there, hand on the door, listening. The voice waited. Between them stretched a silence heavy with meaning, not imposed by force, but shared. In that silence, the war paused, not in reality, but in her understanding of it. And that pause, fragile and fleeting, was enough to leave her frozen, caught between the world she knew too well and the unsettling possibility that this moment might be different. The calm did not dissipate. It settled instead, filling the narrow space between the door and the people waiting behind it, altering the atmosphere without touching anything physical. The woman became aware that what she was experiencing was not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of restraint. That distinction mattered more than she could immediately articulate. Violence could pause accidentally, restraint required intention. Someone outside was choosing, actively, not to escalate. As the voice continued, its cadence remained steady, unbroken by irritation or threat. There was no shift toward impatience, no audible calculation designed to provoke fear. The words themselves seemed secondary to how they were delivered. Tone carried the meaning. It suggested that time was available, that urgency was not a weapon being drawn. This alone contradicted nearly everything she had learned about authority during the war. The effect inside the house was immediate and profound. Movement ceased completely. Even the smallest adjustments, shifting weight, adjusting posture, felt suddenly inappropriate, as if any motion might fracture the fragile equilibrium that had formed. The stillness was no longer defensive. It was reverent, almost cautious. The people inside understood instinctively that something rare was unfolding, something that required witness rather than reaction. Her mind struggled to reconcile the moment with memory. Every past encounter with armed power had followed a predictable arc: control asserted quickly, confusion exploited, compliance enforced. This encounter refused that structure. It offered clarity without coercion. The voice did not rush to establish dominance because it did not need to. That confidence unsettled her more than aggression ever had. She realized then that fear had been doing much of the work for the occupiers she knew. Fear moved people faster than commands, silenced questions, erased resistance before it could form. This voice did not lean on fear. It leaned on something else, perhaps legitimacy, perhaps discipline, perhaps a belief that authority did not require cruelty to be effective. The realization forced her to confront how deeply fear had shaped her understanding of power itself. Inside her chest, her heart slowed further, settling into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in such circumstances. The slowing frightened her. Calm could dull instincts sharpened by survival. It could make one careless. She fought the sensation, attempting to recall the tension she had summoned so easily moments before, but it did not fully return. The calm outside the door exerted its influence inward, crossing the boundary without permission. The house, too, seemed altered by the tone. Shadows appeared softer, less threatening. The narrow corridor no longer felt like a funnel leading toward inevitable humiliation, but like a neutral space awaiting definition. These changes were subtle, almost imagined, yet powerful. War had taught her to read environments quickly, to sense danger in shifts of sound and light. Now she was sensing something else, something she lacked the language to name. She became acutely aware of how little violence actually needed to occur for it to dominate life. Months of occupation had proven that anticipation alone could govern behavior. The cruelty she had braced for had not yet arrived, and its absence revealed how much damage expectation itself had already done. Her body had prepared for pain that had not come. Her mind had rehearsed submission that had not been demanded. The gap between preparation and reality felt destabilizing. The voice outside remained patient. That patience carried moral weight. It suggested that whoever stood there acknowledged the humanity of those inside, even if only implicitly. To wait was to recognize the people behind the door as agents rather than obstacles. That recognition, so rare under occupation, felt almost intrusive. It challenged the protective numbness she had cultivated, the emotional distance that had allowed her to endure without breaking. She felt herself becoming visible again, not physically, but internally. Fear had allowed her to shrink, to disappear into predictability. Calm made her present. It required awareness. It demanded response rather than reflex. This reappearance of self felt dangerous, like stepping into light after months of darkness. Visibility invited judgment, but it also allowed for dignity, something she had learned not to expect. Time lost its usual shape. The moment elongated, no longer measured by urgency but by attention. She could not tell how long the voice had been there, only that it had not changed. That consistency reinforced its sincerity. Cruelty often varied, escalating unpredictably to maintain dominance. This calm remained even, suggesting boundaries the speaker did not intend to cross. She wondered briefly whether this restraint was strategic, part of a broader system designed to win cooperation rather than crush resistance. Even if that were true, it did not erase its immediate impact. Strategy could still carry moral consequence. Methods mattered. How power was exercised shaped how it was received, and in this moment, power was being exercised with deliberate care. Her uncertainty deepened. She no longer knew how to categorize what was happening. The war had forced her to rely on categories to survive. This was enemy territory. That was friendly ground. This uniform meant danger. That language meant threat. The British accent unsettled those divisions. It did not automatically signify safety, but it disrupted the certainty of danger. The disruption left her unmoored. The people inside the house remained frozen not because they were afraid to move, but because moving felt premature. Action required interpretation, and interpretation was still forming. The moment demanded patience, mirroring the patience offered from the other side of the door. It was as if both sides were waiting for the other to define what kind of encounter this would become. She felt a strange pressure building, not toward fear, but toward responsibility. If this authority did not rely on cruelty, then how one responded mattered more. Submission was no longer the only option. There might be space for acknowledgement, for measured cooperation, perhaps even for dignity. The possibility frightened her. Dignity could be lost. It could be violated. But its presence, even briefly, reminded her of what the war had taken. The calm voice continued to exist without asserting itself further. That restraint transformed silence into something shared rather than imposed. Silence under occupation had always been one-sided, enforced by threat. This silence felt mutual, a pause rather than a void. In that pause, the woman felt the war's moral landscape shift slightly, just enough to be felt, not enough to be understood. She became aware of a subtle change within herself, Fear no longer dominated her thoughts. It lingered, cautious and watchful, but it no longer dictated her perception. In its place was a careful attentiveness, a readiness to observe rather than endure. This shift did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Without fear's numbing effect, everything seemed sharper, more fragile. The moment crystallized into something she would remember not for what happened, but for what did not. No shouted orders. No forced entry. No immediate reduction of her world to obedience. The absence of these things echoed louder than their presence ever had. It revealed how normalized cruelty had become, how its absence could feel extraordinary. She understood then why everyone inside had frozen. They were witnessing a moral anomaly. In a war that rewarded brutality and punished hesitation, restraint felt almost transgressive. It disrupted the logic of survival they had learned. It asked them to imagine that power could be exercised without stripping away humanity. That imagination was dangerous, but it was also unavoidable. As the calm endured, it pressed gently against the certainty she had built her life upon. It did not shatter it, but it cracked it, allowing light to enter in thin, unsettling lines. Through those cracks came questions she had long suppressed, about choice, about responsibility, about whether cruelty was truly inevitable or merely permitted. She did not yet know how she would respond, or what would follow once the door was finally opened. But she knew that something irreversible had already occurred. The calm British voice had altered the moral texture of the moment. It had shown her that even in total war, there were degrees of humanity, and that those degrees mattered profoundly. Frozen between expectation and experience, she stood in a space newly defined by restraint. The war had not ended. Danger had not vanished. But the rules had shifted, however briefly. And in that shift, she felt both the weight of everything she had endured and the fragile, unsettling awareness that the future might not be as fixed as she had believed. The moment did not resolve itself quickly. Instead, it deepened, acquiring layers of meaning as the seconds passed without rupture. Authority that did not humiliate. Power that did not revel in fear. The hint was fragile, easily broken, but it existed. She felt the beginnings of something like resolve, not to resist or comply blindly, but to meet this moment with awareness. Whatever happened next, she wanted to remember it accurately, without the distortion of fear or hope. Memory, she knew, would matter later. Moments like this became reference points, shaping how one understood the war long after it ended. The calm outside the door had already done its work. It had disrupted inevitability. It had forced those inside to confront the possibility that the rules they had lived by might not be universal. That disruption did not free them, but it loosened something rigid inside. It created space where none had existed. She took a slow breath, feeling the air move through her chest, grounding herself again. The act felt almost defiant in its normality. Breathing deeply had once been a luxury, something done only when danger receded. Now she did it in the presence of authority, reclaiming a small measure of bodily autonomy. The voice remained steady, patient. No new information arrived, but none was needed. The negotiation was no longer about words. It was about whether fear would resume its role as primary interpreter of reality, or whether something else, judgment, dignity, cautious trust, might take its place, even briefly. She understood that whatever she decided, this moment would stand apart in her memory. It would not blur into the countless other encounters defined by cruelty. It would remain distinct because it asked something different of her. It asked her to be present, to evaluate, to choose. That choice did not feel heroic. It felt heavy, uncertain, fraught with risk. But it was hers. And in a war that had taken so much agency away, the mere existence of that choice felt momentous. The door still separated her from the voice, but the real boundary had shifted inward. The bracing certainty she had relied upon had given way to cautious discernment. The war had not ended, and danger still existed, but the moral landscape had subtly changed. She stood there, holding that change carefully, aware that it could vanish at any moment. Yet even if it did, the fact that it had existed at all mattered. It proved that the war's cruelty was not the only way power could operate, and that knowledge, once acquired, could not be fully erased. In that suspended state, between fear and recognition, she prepared herself not just for what might happen next, but for how she would remember it. The calm British voice had already crossed the threshold that mattered most, altering her understanding of authority itself. Whatever followed would unfold within that altered understanding, shaped by restraint rather than terror, by possibility rather than inevitability. The absence of violence began to weigh on her in ways she had not anticipated. It did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Without cruelty to brace against, there was nothing to push back on, nothing to harden herself around. The calm that lingered outside the door left her without armor, standing unprotected in her own awareness. She realized then how fear had functioned as a kind of shelter, brutal but reliable. It had narrowed the world into something survivable. Calm, by contrast, widened it, and that widening demanded emotional risk. She sensed a quiet shift inside herself, subtle but unmistakable. The tension that had once held her together was loosening, and with it came sensations she had learned to suppress. Fatigue surfaced first, heavy and deep, the accumulated exhaustion of months spent alert, guarded, compressed. Beneath that lay grief, not sharp but pervasive. Grief for routines lost, for trust eroded, for the version of herself that had existed before fear became constant. The calm voice had not caused this grief, but it had allowed it to surface by removing the immediate threat that usually kept such feelings submerged. She wondered if the people outside understood the cost of restraint on those inside. Mercy did not arrive into a neutral space. It entered lives already shaped by harm. Its presence stirred what cruelty had buried. In that sense, kindness was not gentle. It was disruptive. It unsettled the internal order built for survival, forcing a reckoning with everything that had been endured without acknowledgement. Her thoughts drifted to the countless times she had prepared for suffering that arrived right on schedule. Those moments had confirmed her expectations, reinforcing the belief that the world, under war, followed a single moral trajectory downward. This moment contradicted that belief. It suggested that history was not a straight line of degradation, but a field of choices, some exercised with restraint even amid chaos. That suggestion carried weight. It asked her to reconsider not just this encounter, but the framework through which she understood the war itself. She felt a strange guilt arise alongside that reconsideration. Part of her resisted accepting the calm as genuine, not because she believed it false, but because accepting it felt like a betrayal of all the moments when calm had not been offered. How could she allow herself to experience dignity now when so many others had been denied it? The thought unsettled her, intertwining relief with responsibility. Mercy, once received, created obligation, not necessarily to forgive, but to remember accurately, without flattening history into a single narrative of cruelty. The silence continued to hold. No door opened yet. No decision had been announced. And in that suspension, the woman felt time expand beyond the immediate moment. She imagined the future, not in hopeful detail, but as a space where this memory would persist. Years from now, she would recall not what was said, but how it was said. She would remember the tone more vividly than the words. That realization underscored how profoundly human encounters were shaped not just by actions, but by manner. She recognized that the freezing described in her body was not paralysis, but attentiveness taken to its extreme. Every sense felt heightened, not by fear, but by significance. This was a moment that mattered, even if it ended quietly. History, she understood, was not only written in battles and declarations. It was also written in thresholds, in the small, almost invisible reversals that altered how people understood power and themselves.